Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and I am here for my Day 3 Worlds 2022 Group Stage overview and analysis. Of course, if you've been following the first 2 days, you'll know how this goes. I'm going to be going over all 6 games that happened here on day number 3, and of course, the further we get into these group days, the more clear these standings become. We have now gotten to the point where at least one group by the end of the day will have played their entire first round robin. Of course, they'll get their day off tomorrow, but if you guys are enjoying the Worlds content that's been coming out on this channel, let me know down in the comments section below. What game today were you most excited about? What game kind of exceeded your expectations in terms of the competitiveness? Maybe a game you didn't expect to be a stomp, a player that stood out. Anything you guys want to talk about Worlds related down in the comment section below. You guys know I love having that conversation with you all, but let's not waste too much time. Let's go ahead and jump right into our first game here of day number 3. And our first game was a Group C matchup, and actually a matchup I was really interested in pre-tournament. This was something I talked about a lot in the content leading up to Group C, a lot of the preview content. I was really interested to see how these two teams would go about playing each other because I think they actually have pretty contrasting play styles. Of course, I'm talking about the #1 seed from the VCS in Vietnam in GAM Esports and the #1 seed out of the LEC in Europe in Rogue. And certainly a lot of fun information to come out of this one. Rogue is able to take the game in 37 minutes, but what a game this was. Very, very fun game. In my opinion, this was the game of the day. Probably the most entertaining game that we got from start to finish. There were a lot of good ones, a lot of competitive ones, but this one really had the full arc for me of everything that I wanted in League of Legends. Rogue gets out to a really, really hot start. They draft a very typical Rogue comp. I mean, this is almost exactly what this team was playing throughout a majority of their playoff run in the LEC. The Jarvan in the jungle, the Kalista Soraka bot lane, which they did pull out in the LEC finals, Odoamne on some kind of weak side top laner, Ornn in this case, and then Larson on something that can help out the team. A lot of times in playoffs, that was the Victor. Victor gets taken away here by GAM, so they go for the Orianna. Feels a very similar Void, a little bit more supportive rather than damage-oriented, but not bad regardless. And Rogue executed like they knew how to play the comp. Honestly, they played it like they had played it 20 million times before because they have. These are all picks that I would say Rogue are incredibly familiar with, most specifically Malrang on this Jarvan, who just had a phenomenal early game. He was so far down in camps and in farm in general against this Graves because he was making so much action on the Rift. A ton of ganks mid that were able to get Kati caught completely off guard. I mean, he was 0-3, 0-4 by 10 or 11 minutes into the game. Completely disastrous, destroyed that lane from moment 1. Then he was able to go bot lane, try to trade for these 3v3s, but Jarvan has so much trading power early that it was actually pretty easy to get on the hyper-immobile Varus, even with the Tahm Kench there, because let's say Varus has to be eaten by the Tahm Kench. Well, Tom's not all that tanky early on in the game, and Jarvan actually does a really good job of locking him down. Kalista damage can get piled on top of that. Rogue was able to jump out to a really early lead in this game. I'm talking 3k around like 7 or 8 minutes. Like, actually an absurd lead. But GAM didn't stop fighting, and that's what I really respect out of this team. They never feel like they give up, and that's really what GAM was kind of known for in the VCS, at least from what I watched in playoffs, is they really had this spirit of always wanting to fight, always wanting to take good trades, and honestly, big shout out in this game to Kiaya. I'm not going to be able to give him any player of the game nominee because, unfortunately, he wasn't the best player in this game, but he was very close. I think you can make a real argument that he, in fact, was the single best player in this game. The Camille game was impeccable. Not only was he able to pretty much dominate that top lane matchup against Ornn, even though it's relatively Camille favored, so I'm not going to give him like a ton of praise there, but being able to transition that lead on Camille into these team fight advantages where he was really, really difficult to deal with. I'm talking perfect hookshot engages to be able to land on 2, a great teleport to be able to flank and destroy comp on the back end of a fight. You've also got like perfect timings on these ultimates. Of course, as everybody knows, Camille can go invulnerable during her ultimate. Like, there is no way you can hit her. Being able to time that with the Jarvan knockup to not get CC'd is absolutely ginormous, and Kiaya was just putting on a Camille masterclass in this game just in general. You got to give him a ton of credit because he really was trying his best to get this team to win the game. It kind of grew back into a gold neutral state. Honestly, GAM, I think, had a gold lead at around 20-25 minutes. Rogue time certainly activated, kind of culminating in Levy actually stealing a Baron from Rogue and from Malrang, being able to clean up the subsequent fight. I believe it was a 2-for-2 in the subsequent fight, but still, Baron and a 2-for-2 for a team that was behind in gold to push them ahead in gold, that's always going to be a plus. Unfortunately for GAM, they're just not able to close it out. Kiaya was really the only one who was actually playing super well on this team, and he did his best to kind of draw things back for this GAM team, but in the end, I think I don't want to say the dead weights, but the anchors were a little bit too heavy to carry as Rogue were able to take the victory with Kalista doing a lot of damage, but really Soraka coming in super clutch in these last team fights to not only keep everybody healthy, but that silence was absolutely crucial on being able to shut down the Camille, especially in that last team fight. So what did Rogue do well? Well, Malrang, like I said, phenomenal early game. I mean, this is an absolute masterclass on how to get ahead on Jarvan. Obviously, you can criticize a few things that not only him, but everybody here did in the mid game, but at the end of the day, getting that lead is more important than being able to subsequently keep it the entirety of the game. And Malrang has basically perfected the ability to generate leads on this Jarvan. We saw it throughout playoffs. This was a pick that I was kind of criticizing a lot of other teams for playing, but even when Rogue would bring it out, I'd be like, yeah, it's totally okay. I mean, Malrang's just that good at this champion, and he proved that again here on the world stage. I don't think a lot of teams are going to allow them to have this over and over and over again. This is such a comfort pick for Rogue, and they're able to dominate against pretty much everybody. Levy, obviously, a very good early game jungler, goes for the more passive Graves, at least in the early game here, someone who does want to farm up, try to get those camp leads, and be able to affect the game towards the back half, but even if he was against somebody good this game, I don't think there would have been a lot that you could have done to stop Malrang other than just matching him on every single gank. But even then, like on Graves, you're not going to be able to do that. And so, phenomenal game from Malrang, very, very deserving of my player of the game. Like I said, not perfect through the back half, was actually outplayed by Kiaya at some points towards the back half of this game, but for the most part, he was the reason Rogue was able to generate their lead in the first place, and, you know, that subsequently was the reason Rogue was able to win the game at the end. But I think if you're talking about players that really, really helped in those back half of the team fights, it's the bottom lane here. You got to talk about Comp, and you got to talk about Trimby. Obviously, Kalista, Soraka, not necessarily a bot lane duo that you would consider incredibly OP by, like, traditional standards, but these two play both of these champions so effectively. Kalista has been Comp's best champion for years now. We've known that, and Trimby really pulling out the Soraka a ton during playoffs to really show that he is, like, the enchanter guy. I think this meta was essentially perfect for him throughout the year. When I think of Trimby, I think of Nami, and I think of Soraka as of right now, and he really showed that in this game. Not only were the heals absolutely crucial towards the early game, allowing Malrang to play significantly more aggressively in a lot of these scenarios, but the silence was actually incredibly crucial for a lot of these late game team fights. Like I talked about, GAM was really starting to come back and make this game interesting. Rogue ended up being able to neutralize that with a really good team fight surrounding Malrang here and kind of Comp's damage in general, and Trimby was a big reason for that. The silence on the Camille in that final fight was really what secured them the win. Obviously, Kiaya had been doing a great job to be able to disrupt everything that Rogue was doing throughout the game, and Trimby really shutting down Kiaya, allowing Rogue to be able to go in, get that pick on the Camille, end the game was absolutely ginormous. I think Malrang, Trimby, definitely the two standouts from this game in my opinion, but Comp's damage was good. Larson was able to capitalize really, really well on all the ganks that Malrang was throwing his way in the early game on this Orianna. Was a really big shield bot towards the back half, and obviously Cataclysm into Shockwave is a huge wombo that we all know about. Adding on top of that, like Ornn Ultimate, and even putting like Soraka Silence inside of the Cataclysm. There's so many fun things you can do to make that wombo even more intense. And I really think everybody did their job here in this game. You got to give a lot of credit to Rogue because I think they did everything they needed to do. For GAM, on the other hand, so close. So close. Obviously, you had a terrible showing in day number 2, I guess. Day number 1 for you. But day number 2 of the event here against Top Esports. Tough opponent. You come back here against somebody who's significantly more beatable in Rogue, and you really do show up. The early game's not there. You get completely run around the bases by Malrang. I mean, they were just lost. Completely lost. Down 3 or 4k gold, like I said, at 8 or 9 minutes into the game. Most of that, unfortunately, was on Kati. Like, Kati just played so poorly in the early game. He was on the victory, gets his flash blown incredibly quickly by the Jarvan-Orianna combo, and still dies to the gank, and that means he's just open to be repeat ganked over and over and over again, and he never really takes it seriously. He's constantly pushed away from tower, constantly in range for the Jarvan to be able to contest. Yes, you would have been basically sacking your lane, but at this point, not only do you lose all the CS that you were trying to get by stepping up, but you also give the other team a ton of kills. Levy ends up dying in a mid lane accident as well. This gold lead really spirals out of control, but like I said, Kiaya so phenomenal in this mid to late game on the Camille. Truly, truly spectacular. Kiaya actually wasn't the player I was most excited to see on this team. It was Levy, Style, and BA that I was really coming into the tournament expecting to be the carries for GAM, but Kiaya really stepped up, and it makes me interested to see what else he can do in this tournament. If he maybe had a little bit of a better team around him, maybe Kati, you know, maybe played a little bit more safe, this could have been very winnable for GAM, but unfortunately, Kati's going to get my debt of the game because of that early game. Not only that, but the fact that, I mean, he was basically a ward towards the back half of the game. Not only was he not doing damage, but he gets caught out in a side lane just as GAM is starting to build, like, the most amount of momentum that they've had the entirety of the game, and that's just gotta feel entirely disappointing if you're GAM. I think a better mid laner in this game, and you just have a potential to win. Not to flame, but just a really, really rough game from Kati here, and I think he's gonna look back on it and regret it a lot, so... For GAM, what do I think of them? Well, I think they played this game pretty okay. Obviously, you just simply have to have a better early game. You're not going to be allowed to get into a lot of these games like you were in this one if you have this bad of an early game. Luckily, Kiaya played well. You have a jungler in Graves who is going to scale, and a lot of extra supportive CC here from the Varus, from the Tahm Kench. Even if they're not doing ridiculous amounts of damage from behind, they're still going to be relatively useful. And so there was an avenue back in. You're probably not going to have this in every game, though. This was a team that I expected to be able to generate early leads because of their aggressive mentality. Unfortunately, it's kind of translated into early deficits because they put themselves in positions where they just simply shouldn't be. If you can kind of get that ball rolling a bit earlier in the game, you're going to have a much easier time beating these teams on the next go-around. As for Rogue, great early game, great late game. You just got to fix Rogue time. It always comes back to bite this team when they can't afford it the most. Luckily, they are good enough to be able to outmaneuver GAM in this game, but if they put themselves in a similar position against a team like DRX, against a team like Top Esports in this group, I'm not sure they're going to be in that. Obviously, great win yesterday against DRX, but their hardest challenge comes tomorrow against Top Esports. They're going to have to simply be better than this in closing out the mid game. The early game strategies were great. The late game team fighting was really effective, but you have to be able to hold on to that lead. I have confidence and faith in this Rogue team because they were really good at that throughout playoffs, kind of bucking the Rogue time trend, but it definitely is still something to note of. Obviously, I've said this for a while, Rogue is probably the best drafting team in the world. Freddy obviously puts Rogue in a great position pretty much every single time they go out on the Rift. It's all about execution now from these players, and as long as they can perform the same way that they did in the LEC, I really don't have a ton of worries about them, at least making a good push to be able to get out of this group. Moving on to game number 2 now, we're going to hop from Group C over to Group D, as obviously Group D didn't exactly start out in the way that anybody thought it would. I got both of my predictions for Group D's game number 1s wrong on day 1. Hopefully I can rebound a bit here as we get into maybe a little bit more of an obvious day in terms of results. And we kick that off as we have a matchup between the number 2 seed from the LCS in North America in 100 Thieves, taking on the number 1 seed from the LCK in Korea in Gen.G. And yes, we are back on track, folks. We are right back on track in Group D as Gen.G is able to pick up the win, although it's not nearly as dominant as I would have hoped to see from this Gen.G team, especially with how 100 Thieves have not only played in day number 1 against the Oysters, but like they played again today. I mean, this really was a one-man roster, but we'll talk about that in a bit. Let's get on Gen.G first. And there actually were a lot of good things to talk about with Gen.G in this game, although it wasn't nearly as dominant as one would hope this game would have been for Gen.G. At least they're able to come out on top. I think they played the game pretty slow, pretty methodical, and while it was even for a while, probably a lot longer than me and a lot of other people would have wanted it to be, they ended up getting the job done. There was some good team fighting towards the back half of this game, mostly led from the fact that 100T didn't really have a good way to engage on the Trundle. The Trundle was going to be a huge problem pretty much all of the time because when 100 Thieves go in here, you've got the Talia wall potentially to be able to split off the fight, but outside of that, you're relying on a ton of damage from both the Aatrox and the Misfortune, and honestly, Trundle really makes both of them a lot more difficult to actually perform. You have a ton of good candidates for Trundle to ultimate here, whether it is the Poppy, whether it's the Leona, or whether it's the Aatrox himself, depending on the build that he goes. Obviously, someday goes damage in this game, so it's not quite as applicable, but still, some options to go for there, and then obviously, Trundle into Misfortune is a great matchup for the Trundle, because that MF ult comes out. If you're at all within range, you can interrupt the cast with the Pillar, and it just makes these team fights a lot more difficult for 100 Thieves, not to mention the fact that Trundle's movement speed allows him to speed up himself so that he can get to moments where he can kind of disrupt that front line a little bit more. FBI never was really able to find a good flank angle to hit that ultimate in, hit the bullet time in the entirety of this game, and I think a lot of that, in my opinion, was due to Peanut on this Trundle, and that's why he's going to get my player of the game here, although I do think you can give heavy player of the game considerations to Lehens down in the support position on the Renata. A much better game in game 2 here. He was not good on his signature singed in game number 1, but the Renata felt a lot more comfortable here. He was able to open up the map quite a bit, actually, I would say, for Gen.G. Those ultimates in the back half of fights were really making it difficult for Someday to feel comfortable going all the way in, which he kind of had to do, especially against this all-in comp that Gen.G has available to them. They've got the Camille, they've got the Trundle, held the Renata ult going in, and then you've got a Azir and a Aphelios on the backline. Very good front-to-back team fighting potential with the Camille on the flank especially, and so some really good tools for Gen.G to go in. You're really relying a lot on that Aatrox engage. on the side of 100 Thieves, and Lehens just made that significantly more difficult. Really liked how he played this game. A great bounce back from a rough game 1, in my opinion. But everybody on Gen.G was fine here. Doran certainly had his moments where he wasn't perfect on the Camille. Someday, I think, played this game really well, but even generally speaking, after lane phase, he was pretty consistent with his engages, even if he was the one that was kind of getting picked on a bit by 100T. And then Chovy and Ruler were fine. Really not stand out in this game. I was hoping for a bit more from both of them. Chovy made some really good plays with some ultimates towards the back half, but Ruler was never, like, dominant in this one, and I really just want to see him be able to turn that knob up. Obviously, he wasn't quite there against Gala and RNG in game number 1. Wasn't quite dominant in this game number 2 either. I just want to see him be the best AD carry in the world. I know he can do it. It's not like he hasn't performed on the international stage before, and it's not like he didn't just have his best year ever in the LCK, and so I think you can make a real case that he's just warming up. Hopefully, once he gets a little bit more accustomed to the meta, it's not like these champions aren't things that he has performed on in the past. I really don't have a lot of ways to believe that Ruler isn't going to be dominant once he just clicks it into gear. Same with Chovy. These two are really phenomenal. Chovy was really big for this Gen.G team, just in general, because of the lead he was able to generate as well in that mid lane. So just a lot of good stuff overall from Gen.G. Not a perfect game, though. The macro at times wasn't nearly aggressive enough. When you're going against a team like 100 Thieves, especially one that, you know, you really want to be able to put away relatively consistently, I don't like being relatively even throughout most of this game. And it wasn't even really 100 Thieves that were playing super well. It was mostly Gen.G just not taking advantage of a lot of the opportunities that were given to them and really not pushing the tempo all that much. I understand that you've got Azir, you've got Aphelios, you got Trundle, you got Camille. Like, you're going to scale into the late game. I'm not really scared about your team fight if this goes even. You're better players, and you have the better comp for that specific instance, but I just want to see Gen.G be a little bit more proactive when it comes to trying to push the tempo, because 100 Thieves certainly weren't doing that, even though it was kind of their onus, too. So, you know, it is what it is. I'm not going to complain about Gen.G too much, but definitely some things I think they need to clean up. As for 100 Thieves, this was a one-man show. This was Someday versus the world. He absolutely tried his best on his Aatrox, his signature Aatrox pick. I've talked about this so many times on the channel at this point, but Someday's Aatrox is actually just built different. We can talk about NA Tops just not being there, what with how Fudge has been playing at the tournament, how Impact has been playing at the tournament, but you cannot say the same thing about Someday in this particular instance. His Aatrox was phenomenal and really was the only reason that 100 Thieves were even in this game at all. He was dominating the laning phase against Doran, who a lot of people consider to be close to a top 20 player at this World Championships, and then he was able to transition that really well into the late game. The problem is he didn't have any backup whatsoever. He played great, but nothing from Abadage, nothing from FBI, Hui with some terrible engages on the Leona. Closer had some good moments, but for the most part was just kind of irrelevant for most of this game. It really genuinely was a 1v9 for Someday, and unfortunately, against the best team in the LCK, you are just not going to win those, but I gotta continue to rag on him, and I hate doing this. I hate being super negative on my channel about a player over and over and over again. It's always frustrating to do that because it just doesn't feel very positive to do so, but it's analysis. I gotta talk about what happened. Abadage with another bad game here, and he's just kind of continued this downward trend. He was not good at all pretty much throughout the entirety of the 2022 season. He kind of stepped it up towards the back half of Summer Split, was okay in playoffs, certainly wasn't great, but was good enough in playoffs to get this team to the finals, but he has not been good so far at Worlds. He got completely destroyed by Mission. He gets completely destroyed by Chovy in lane here. Not the worst loss in the world, but on the Taliyah, you just simply have to be more proactive. This is an early game comp. You've got the Misfortune, you got the Leona, you got the Taliyah, even the Poppy. Like, all of these things want to try to make plays, want to try to generate that lead so that the team fights in the later part of the game can just become easier because you have that macro advantage. If you don't have that, this comp doesn't really work in the same way, and Abadage, unfortunately, just wasn't nearly proactive enough. So he's going to get my dud of the game here again. And I gotta give a little bit of a shout out for dud of the game to FBI as well. He got dud of the game in game number 1 against CFO. He very much almost got it in game number 2 here. Some of these ultimates were just straight up bad. I rewatched some of these fights and just the angles, they're not good. Like, I understand what he's trying to do, but he did so little damage towards the back half of this game. Obviously, not a ton of setup. You go for the Leona instead of the Amumu. First of all, hate that. Don't understand that. Not nearly the same kind of forceful lockdown that Amumu is going to give you, but even then, if Huhi's just better at Leona, that's fine. Those engages have to be capitalized on, and Huhi was going in without any sort of backup, and then by the time FBI was hitting that ult button, nobody was getting hurt, and the fight was over, and so a lot of just really bad gameplay overall from 100 Thieves. You gotta hope that they're able to clean that up moving into the rest of this group, or there's a very realistic possibility that this team could be sitting at, maybe at best, at 1-5. Like, I don't really see an opportunity for them to beat Gen.G or beat RNG when they're playing like this. They're gonna have chances to, but I just don't see that being all that likely, especially if Abadage and FBI do not step up. They are incredibly crucial to how this team plays. It's really just Someday versus the world right now, and that's kind of how it felt for a lot of the regular season too. It was a big reason I was never nearly as high on this team as a lot of other people were, if you go back and watch my LCS reviews, and so that's 100 Thieves. For Gen.G, you just gotta clean things up. I want you to start pushing the tempo a little bit more. I understand drafting scaling against a team that you think you can beat. Going into the late game with the Azir, Aphelios, even at even, you were relatively feeling comfortable just because you're the better team, but I don't want to see you be even for 20 minutes against 100 Thieves. I want to see you blow them off the table, and so you're going to be able to try and do that against CFO in your next group game until we get to that final group day for Group D, and I need to see that. I need to see that basically right now, and hopefully they can really turn that around. The LCK #1 seed certainly not looking the way that I thought they would going into this group stage, but obviously a ton of time still left to improve. They're one of the few teams that hasn't really had a chance to play at all recently. Remember, out of every single team at the tournament, they have waited the longest to play again, and I don't think it's really a patch problem. Some people are saying that. I think they actually, they fit the patch relatively well. I think they just need to get their footing in this patch, and then hopefully they can live up to the standards that I think me and a lot of other analysts had for them going into this tournament. Jumping back into Group A now as we move on to game number 3, and game 3 was definitely an interesting one, especially with how Group A is starting to shake out. Pretty much every game from here on out matters, especially for the top teams in this group, which really looks like everybody except for Cloud9, but we'll talk about that later. It was a really, really interesting matchup between the number 3 seed out of the LPL in China in Edward Gaming and the number 3 seed out of the LEC in Europe in Fnatic, and obviously Fnatic has kind of bounced off to a really, really quick start in this group, going 2-0, being able to beat Cloud9, being able to beat T1 in a big cycle, but EDG, not so much. Being destroyed by T1, they did get their grip back against C9 in that game number 2, a very important game 3 for both of these teams, and EDG is able to take it in about 36 minutes. Actually, a much closer game than it ever had any right to be, considering how it started. Yes, EDG was able to win this, but they were given such a head start from Fnatic with that awful, disastrous level 1 that ends up happening. You get a double kill on Sivir just going into laning phase. Upset and Hylissang are already down a ton of gold against a Sivir Yuumi, a matchup that you're really just supposed to win as Kalista Renata. You have to be able to win that because the Sivir is just exclusively going to be able to outscale your entire team, and so from the jump, you were already at such a disadvantage, and even from there, Upset and Hylissang, I thought, played out the lane relatively well. Viper and Mako were actually pressured out a considerable amount here. This is kind of how you end up pressuring the Sivir Yuumi out. I've seen a lot of conversation about this on social media where a lot of people don't think that the Sivir Yuumi is all of that, like, beatable, and I disagree. I think Sivir Yuumi is definitely beatable. I think Kalista has always been the thing that I want to see the most coming out from teams as an answer to it, and this is kind of the reason why. Even down 2 kills at level 1, Upset won this lane. Like, he was out, even in CS, completely up in lane pressure. Unfortunately, from that point onwards, it was just much more difficult for them to actually do anything because Viper kind of hit that accelerated point a little bit earlier than he needed to, but in a more average lane state here, without those kills, I actually do think that this Fnatic bot lane wins the lane. And that's adding on top of the fact that Humanoid was completely, utterly broken in this game with how good he was. Going back and rewatching some of these fights was an absolute treat. Humanoid was beautiful in some of these engages on the Azir. The damage that he was outputting was absolutely ludicrous, and he was almost single-handedly keeping Fnatic in this game. I've talked about this a bit on the channel already, but you can make a really strong case that Humanoid was and is the best player at the World Championships in terms of performance right now. Zika's right up there, but those two dominated play-ins, and they both have turned up a lot in group stage, most notably Humanoid, though. He's going up against some of the best talent in the world. Faker is in this group. Scout is in this group. Jensen's in this group. But, you know, the first two are very, very good, and he's holding his own. He's arguably been better than all of them by a considerable margin, might I add. And he was a great, again, this game. He dominated Scout in lane. The Azir-Victor matchup is relatively boring, I would say, for most of the game. Both of them just kind of want to hit their spikes towards the back half, but Humanoid played the second half super duper well and was really keeping Fnatic in this. Unfortunately for them, EDG was simply just too far ahead, and they're not bad enough to throw this kind of lead, right? They're too good of a team to lose given 2 kills at level 1, and so give a lot of credit to EDG. Player of the game is going to go to Viper for me on that Sivir. Really, really fun to watch him be able to navigate a lot of the pressure that he was getting in this game from basically level 2. There was a lot of attention spent down towards that bot lane to try and make sure that Upset and Hylissang could recover, and honestly, they did a really good job, but it just was never going to be enough to stop Viper, who does end up hitting that 3, 4, eventually 5 item Sivir power spike, and from that point onwards, the game is completely over. The ricochets are doing 700 damage a pop, and if Azir or Kalista step even remotely in range of that Sivir, they are just simply going to die without any sort of recuperance. And you add on top of that, that Yuumi is on top of that Sivir, making sure that she's never really in that much danger. Spell Shield, Yuumi heals, even the speed up both from her ultimate and from Yuumi in general. Add on to that Yuumi Q slows. Like, it's just so difficult to actually get on top of this Sivir, even with just the support being the peel. Everybody else still kind of engaging. That's not even taking into account that Victor can stun and root enemies, that Lee Sin has the kick to keep people off, that Gragas has a ton of disengage. There's so many tools here to get that Sivir moving along, and Viper did such a phenomenal job at being able to capitalize on it. A great game from one of the best AD carries in the world. Very deserving a player of the game. Mako obviously deserves a lot of praise for the Yuumi game as well. It's hard to praise a Yuumi, but again, Yuumi's at the point right now where she's going to be doing a boatload of damage, and especially paired up with Sivir, the poke in lane is going to be incredible. But the poke out of lane is honestly more impressive, especially now with the ult cooldown reduced. The amount of plays that Mako could make in this game just generally around the map with that ultimate, it was astounding, and it really allows Yuumi to be much more proactive as a gank threat, a quote-unquote non-traditional gank threat, because she's really scary if she just pops up in the jungle or pops up in the mid lane and throws out ultimate, and now you've got all these heals, you've got the speed up on whoever you're fighting. Like, it's so much worse to run into her than it is a lot of other supports right now. So Mako played that really well. Viper and Mako continue to be one of the best bot lanes in the world, pretty much no question. There were a little bit of flaws on the side of EDG. I think JJ didn't necessarily push the early game lead nearly as much as he should have. Razork was relatively passive on this Poppy, and I think that was a good thing for Fnatic overall. They just wanted to hit their late game power spikes. Kalista obviously does want to win early, but at that point where you're already down in the bot lane, you're playing for Ornn, and you're most specifically playing for Azir, and so you need to start prepping for a lot of these late game engages, and I think Razork did a relatively okay job of that. JJ really needed to push the tempo, I think, a bit more. I think there was a lot that he could do in the top lane with this Gragas, trying to acquire Rift Heralds, you know, trying to push the tempo. Eventually, JJ did get online and start to do that, but I wanted to see a little bit more action from him. That's really the big difference, and I talked about this in a previous video, between him and Gen.G, the other jungler here for EDG, is that Gen.G much more early game focused, JJ much more late game focused, so it's interesting to me that JJ would select the Lee Sin here. I don't mind the draft really at all. It's an early game presence to try and stabilize until you can get Sivir Yuumi online. Victor being a secondary carry. Really good idea, I think, in general here, but JJ just needs to play a little bit more aggro. Flandre had a really good teleport, I will note. Not a lot to talk about with him, but really good teleport towards the back half of the game that actually ended up sealing a fight for them. Some of the ultimates were not all that good, but at the end of the day, it's Gragas. He just has to stand there and be a little bit bulky, and he's probably fine. As for Fnatic, on the other hand, like I said, Upset and Hilly tried their best, most notably Upset, but man, Hilly was bad this game. And this is something that's become a little bit of a recurring trend with Hylissang at the World Championships right now, is that when the rest of the team's playing well, he's just kind of not up to par. And there were so many moments I found myself watching this game where I was like, Hilly, you're Renata, ult, like you have pressed the button, it's off cooldown, you can press the button. It felt like he was waiting and waiting and waiting for these perfect Renata ultimates that were going to change everything, but if you throw that out, the amount of disruption that gives the front line of EDG, whether it's Gragas, whether it's Lee Sin, Victor doesn't really have all that much mobility. It's pretty easy to create a scenario in which that can just become a problem, giving a a player like Humanoid or giving a player like Upset some time to do some damage in late game team fights. And honestly, both of them were playing well towards the late game. They weren't ever really in that much danger, at least in terms of these fights. Obviously, I talked about the Sivir ricochets being a huge problem. There's not really a ton of way to stop that, but they both juggled proximity really well. They were kiting really well. There wasn't a ton of danger for them unless these fights started to break down. Upset really started to go in towards the back half, trying to do a ton on that Kalista. Some really heartbreaking moments where the E reset doesn't quite end up happening. He's not able to get the kills and such that end up losing the fights, but Humanoid was really trying his best. The amount of damage that Azir was putting out was great. If they had Renata ult to back that up, I think this could have been a ton easier. Unfortunately, Razork wasn't all that good either. Not much you can do when you are down gold basically from moment one, and it's not really your fault, but the Poppy pick, something that you really do need to be able to get moving on. Obviously, Fnatic does want to end up scaling here with the Ornn and the Azir, but generally speaking, I just need to see a little bit more proactivity out of Poppy in general. Ornn was fine. Everything else was fine. Really, I just wanted to see a little bit different. I think, and this is what I'll wrap up with for Fnatic, right, is if the level 1 goes differently, there is a good chance they win this game, because I do think Humanoid was probably the best player in this game. Unfortunately, the deficit was too big, Viper was given too much of a lead, and from that point, he's just too good to be able to lose this game, and so EDG was put in a spot where they were given basically all the resources they need to win. But if you're looking at Fnatic and trying to project towards the future, this is a team that I think very realistically could make it out of this group, and that is not something I expected to say. They looked, I'm not going to say like the better team, but like Humanoid was the best player in this game, in my opinion. And he has been one of the best players all tournament long. If he can keep that up, if he can arguably be the best player in this group, Fnatic actually has a pretty decent shot at being able to get out. If they play a game like this from even, again, I actually think they could potentially beat EDG, and that could be absolutely ginormous. For EDG, though, you gotta feel good. You were given the opportunity. Yes, it wasn't like, you know, the most standard level one, and you definitely had an advantage, but you didn't throw it away. They played really well, and you were able to keep your advantage, you were able to keep the lead, and you were able to finish it off. That's still a huge trait. Not throwing leads, very, very important. This EDG team obviously has the clutch team. They just won Worlds last year. We know that they're able to play really, really well in the playoffs and in regional gauntlets because regular season was the worst part of their split this year, so I'm not super worried about these guys like stepping up and being important when it matters the most. I just don't know what exactly the ceiling for them is. I really liked how Viper and Mako played this game, but if they're not going to be able to generate consistent leads through that bot lane, that's always been the problem with EDG. I like more early game focused bot lanes for EDG where they can move to more late game scaling in the mid lane, in the top lane. I think that's always been something that they've worked best with, and it'll be interesting to see if they stick with this mentality or if they kind of change up draft strategies moving forward. But with all that said, EDG still comes away with the victory and so completes the Group A Circle of Suck as EDG has now beaten Fnatic. Fnatic beat T1 and T1 beat EDG, so it's really going to be up to the rest of the group stage, kind of the final day here for Group A, to see who exactly is the favorite to be getting out of these groups at 1 and 2. Moving on to game number 4 now. We're going to stick with Group A, moving into the final Group A match of the first half of round robin. Yes, Group A has played all 3 of the days so far. That means they get day 4 off, but it means that after today, we're going to know where everyone stands going into that final Group A day. And so our final matchup is going to be between the number 1 seed from the LCS in North America in Cloud9 and the number 2 seed from the LCK in Korea in T1. And a lot of people thought this was going to go a certain way going into the day, and boy, did that hold true as T1 takes a pretty commanding victory over Cloud9 in this one. And I'm going to get to Cloud9. I certainly have a lot to say about how they have been playing, how they have been drafting. But let's get to T1 first. This is a pretty typical T1 draft for a lot of the regular season. I actually criticized a lot of these drafts that came out from them in a similar vein in the regular season because it felt like they were putting their priorities in a weird spot. Very heavily reliant on Gumayusi and Zeus. That's obviously really good for topside. Gumayusi, however, not coming off of some of the best performances at Worlds so far and coming off of arguably his worst split as a pro in summer, and definitely something to consider there. Mostly what I'm worried about is Faker off of these more active playmakers. Obviously, he got to play Akali in the first 2 games. He gets put back on Lissandra duty. He's been on this so much this year. It feels like it's been his most played champion. I don't have the stats to back that up right now, but it's certainly from the eye test, from the heart test. It feels like this has been his most played champion all year. You're putting a lot of faith into Owner to be able to generate early game leads, and a lot of faith into both Zeus and Gumayusi to have these front-to-back team fights, with Lissandra and Oyster really creating a lot of those opportunities. Of course, Cloud9 not the exact type of team that's going to be able to match you in those front-to-back team fights. So I understand the ideology, maybe just taking the playmaking onus off of some of the players I would like it on, but you know what? It worked out in this one because the players that really stood out for T1, Zeus and Gumayusi. So congratulations, T1. You kind of got back to your roots here. This very much felt like a spring T1 game from this year, and that's always a good sign. Remember, I know it feels like a lifetime, an eternity ago, but T1 at the beginning of this year, going into MSI, undefeated in the LCK. I think we all tend to forget that because of how MSI went, and then of course them just being objectively the second best team, getting pretty outclassed by Gen.G for a majority of summer split, but this was, they were unbeatable with these 5 in spring, and honestly, that formula is still there. I think a lot of teams have grown around them, and obviously, I think some players have taken maybe a little bit of a mental step back, but to pretend like they can't bring that out again, and that this team couldn't be a favorite to win the World Championship, I just don't think is all that realistic. Gumayusi, if he's going to play like this on a champion like Kai'Sa, oh my god, is this series going to be easy for T1? Is the rest of this group stage going to be easy? They had troubles with Fnatic because they couldn't get that bot lane rolling. The Lucian Nami really decimating Guma and Keria in the previous one. Guma and Keria get a lead in this, and it is easy mode. They dominate this game. It's never close. They're able to take 11 towers to Cloud9's 0, and a lot of that is Guma just being so far ahead that there is nothing they can do. You force feed this Kai'Sa over and over and over again, and eventually you just get to this breakpoint where she can actually just W, ult, auto attack, and you die. Like, that's all you need. The Q is obviously there. It can be a little bit unreliable. I talk about this just because you can't aim it, but at the same time, it's still, even if you get like 2 of them, it's a ridiculous amount of damage, and you're killing in 3 autos anyways with the crit build. And so, like, Kai'Sa hits this breakpoint where she's just unkillable. She does have to risk a lot to do it, but in this comp, when you're so far ahead, not so much. And so Guma, pretty easy choice for player of the game. He was doing 1 billion damage. He just 1v1'd everybody in the game by the end. I think 2 quadra kills for him this game. It's got to feel a little bit bad that he couldn't get the penta. Fudge denying that towards the back half with the Winions, but Still, really good game from Guma, really good game from Keria on the Oyster. I've actually been a little bit disappointed in how Keria has shown up so far. It feels like we're more going back to the meta that Keria would thrive in, these more engage-oriented supports that want to enable a hyper carry in the bot lane. This really felt like what Keria was dominant on, and the first couple games just weren't there for this bot lane. T1's bot lane still looked like a weakness, I would say, for the team overall, you know, maybe not in like a grand scheme, but in terms of like being a top 3-4 team in the world, a quote-unquote weakness, right? But Keria looked phenomenal in this one on the Oyster. He's obviously very accomplished on the pick. I would be surprised to see this get through a lot of their drafts. Keria's really good on Oyster, and obviously the Leona felt like a takeaway as well, but we'll get to that in a second for Cloud9. Overall, just a really good game from T1's bot lane, and they continue to march forward. And then Zeus in the top lane, you can't give him Aatrox. It's simply just too good. You gotta ban out the Aatrox, but especially if you're not going to first pick it, right? I understand first picking the Azir, because Jensen is much better on these control style mages, and Azir is just by far the best one in the meta right now, but you can't give Zeus Aatrox. You just simply can't. It's a bad draft decision, especially when every other power pick is off the board. You're not really trading anything. It's not like Aatrox for Maokai or something like that. It's literally just giving them Aatrox, and so not a good move from them, but T1 played it out well. Not a lot of complaints, honestly. Guma and Keria carried the game. Zeus and Owner really were proactive in the early part and were able to generate leads, but by the 15-minute mark, this game was like super duper over, so there's not really a ton to talk about on T1's side. What I really want to spend time on in this segment talking about is Cloud9, because it just feels so fundamentally broken, right? Like, Evil Geniuses, fine, like, they're in a group of death, and honestly, they put up a fight against Gen.G, and it looks like they're at least, like, buckling down. 100 Thieves, like, they don't look great. They lost to Flying Oysters, but at the end of the day, they're at least, like, struggling because of their performance, right? It very much feels like Abadage just isn't good enough at this level right now. Like, FBI is just not good enough at this level right now. That feels more comfortable to me than where Cloud9 is at, where it's like, I feel like this team has lost every semblance of an identity that they had going into this tournament. I really, really liked what this team was doing towards the back half of playoffs. I talked about this a lot on the channel with the LCS recaps, where Cloud9 found a formula of get Berserker on this hyper carry that's going to be able to scale up and give him the proactivity to be able to do that. Put Sven on an Enchanter. He doesn't play Engagers. Put him on the Yuumi. Put him on the Lulu. I get that they've been nerfed, and I get Yuumi is banned against you, but Lulu is playable. Nami is playable. Soraka is playable. Like, these things can come out, and we know Sven can play at least a couple of those, and then make sure that Blabber can help win you the game. Jensen spends his entire time, at least in playoffs, prioritizing getting out of laning phase, moving Blabber along, getting that jungle advantage, and being able to take over the macro part of the map. Fudge can counterpick in the top lane, or he can just play passive. It doesn't really matter. You're losing, like, the focal points, which were Blabber and Berserker, the entirety of your playoff run. You have spent almost every single game at Worlds this year trying to get Fudge ahead on a counterpick in the top lane, either on the 2 games of Fiora or on the Jax here, which is just simply not going to work. I don't mean to be mean to Fudge. I really don't want to flame him or anything, but it just doesn't seem like he's going to be able to hold up at this level playing these super duper aggressive picks against these players. That's fine. There aren't a lot of players in the world that can do that, but you have to be able to recognize that and move to something else. Blabber has been exclusively on passive tanks the entirety of Worlds so far. The most aggressive pick he's had was the Poppy in this game. Where is the Graves? Where is the Hecarim? Where are these things that he can genuinely win the game with, that you can funnel your resources and your energy into? Why are you first picking Azir? I just simply do not understand it. You banned Graves on blue side. It just makes absolutely no sense to me. And then first picking Azir for Jensen, putting a lot of responsibility on, quite frankly, your worst performing laner of the split. You can talk about how Jensen got significantly better towards the back half, and I completely agree with you. I think you put Jensen and Abadage up against each other, where I think a lot of people talk about Abadage having a really rough beginning and really turning it on towards the end. I think that's the narrative that should be given to Jensen, who was really not good at the beginning of Summer Split, tried to get reacclimated to pro, but by the time playoffs rolled around, he really found an identity that he could attach to, and it really pushed him forward into being one of the more useful members of Cloud9. They've completely abandoned that. They're putting him on Azir. They're making him go and try and be the carry in the late game for this team because Fudge is super far behind, and Trist isn't going to be that for your team. She's going to be a great secondary damage dealer, but Azir is your pick here. And that's just not Jensen's playstyle. He's not the kind of laner that can take all these resources and dominate with them. He hasn't been that all year long. I don't know why you are changing everything up so much right now. It is so frustrating. I gotta talk about Fudge. He got completely run over in the top lane. Zeus dominated this counter pick matchup for Fudge, and that's all I really have to say. This is the third game in a row in this group where Fudge has been given counter pick. He's picked a split pushing duelist, and he's lost. And he's not lost gracefully, he's lost hard. He picked Fiora into Ornn in game 1, went relatively neutral and just wasn't nearly as useful in the late game. He picked Fiora into Aatrox in game number 2, and he gets beaten up. He's not nearly useful at all, but he's not, like, dead in the water. And then he picks Jax here in game number 3 against the Aatrox, and he gets legitimately run over. Like, he was, I mean, just completely outclassed in this game. They weren't even on the same planet in this one, and it's just gotta be frustrating. Obviously, he's not gonna feel good. I don't feel good calling him the dud of the game or anything like that, but at some point, you just gotta sit there and go, like, this isn't working. We have to adapt. Put Fudge on Ornn. I don't care. I'm sorry, Fudge. You're a good player, but it's not working right now. Put Blabber on Hecarim, on Graves. Leave these picks up. Try to take them. Try to facilitate Blabber. Pick the Orianna. Pick the Zillion. These are the things that were working for you. And we've seen from pretty much every other team at this tournament that if you invest into the things that got you here, it will work out. And so, and also put Sven, like, don't let him first time Leona on stage at Worlds. Come on. We're smarter than this. Anyways, Cloud9's got a lot of work to do, but at this point, they're all but eliminated, right? Everybody in this group is now 2-1, except for Cloud9, who's 0-3. They've basically got to go perfect and got to hope even other things move in their direction to even get a tiebreaker at a chance of getting out of this group, but I guess technically it's possible, but again, they're going to have to change every single thing that they're doing right now because the preparation that they've had going into this tournament is literally disastrous, and it's going to cost them even remotely a chance at getting out of this group. And then for T1, this is great. You put yourself, like I said, at that 3-way tie at 2-1 at the top of the group, the circle of suck, as most people like to call it. And I definitely think you showed good things here. If the top and bot lanes can really start to push forward like they did in spring, you can have Faker as that more facilitator, owner kind of controlling the map and carry it for engages. That's the best form of T1 that we've had all year long, and that's kind of the version it looks like we're getting right now. They just need to be able to maintain that against some of the best teams in the world. Luckily, I do think they have the talent to do so, and so I think this T1 team might honestly be a little bit underrated by the grand scheme of things right now. Moving on to game number 5 now. We move back to Group D, kind of going in a circle this whole day, starting with C, going to D, A, D, and then back to C. Big ol' roundabout here, but moving on to game number 5, a pretty highly prioritized team that a lot of people have really started talking about recently. And then also the LPL rep. We have the number 4 seed from the LPL in China in Royal Never Give Up, taking on the number 1 seed from the PCS in CTBC Flying Oyster. Woohoo! We get the matchup everybody wanted to see at Worlds this year, unfortunately, for all parties involved. RNG ended up having to spoil the fun and win the game. Jokes aside, really good game from RNG. I mean, it's just them asserting dominance. Like, nobody on this team was remotely on their level, and they kind of proved that, I think, relatively consistently over the course of this game. Breathe gets a signature Fiora, Wei gets a signature Viego. I know it's not Vi, but it's pretty close. Those are the 2 champions he really plays. Xiaohu on something that can support the map, and Gala on Aphelios. I mean, it really just feels like everything. Maybe the Kai'Sa would have been a little bit more thematic for an RNG theme team. I'd even mention Ming on set. These are basically every champion that they played the most this year, or at least the champions I associate the most with them this year in particular. Gala, maybe the Kai'Sa, obviously, but just Aphelios, let me tell you, he played the Aphelios like it was Kai'Sa in this game. And in fact, I'll start with Gala, because I've talked some shit. I'll be honest. I'll admit. I'm a little lower on Gala, I would say, than a majority of other people. A lot of people talk about him as a top 3, top 4 ADC in the world. Not quite there for me. He's really freaking good. Probably a top 3 ADC in the LPL. But I don't know, I think top 3 in the world's probably a little bit rich, just for my taste. Mostly my problems with him, and I've talked about this in almost every single video that I've talked about Gala in, is the fact that while he is a genuinely phenomenal late-game teamfighter, and he's someone who can actually just straight up win you games if you get to a certain breakpoint with him on a certain champion, I just need to see that killer instinct, pun entirely intended, out of him in the early parts of the game. It is quite often that he just plays to go even, and Ming does a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of the actual pushing forward of the game towards that bot side. And obviously, that's the support role just in general, but I think Gala, more so than other top 80 carries, doesn't really have a ton of agency over whether or not he wins or loses lane. It really just feels like he's along for the ride, and then eventually hits this point in the game where he's like, oh yeah, now I know what to do, right? And for him to be one of the top 3 ADCs in the world, I just wanted to see him. I wanted to see him get super aggressive. I wanted to see him dictate lane tempo. I wanted to see him be able to play aggressive. He's woken up. Worlds has clearly unlocked something else in him. And all the people who are in the comment section are gonna be like, yeah, I was always like this. No, he wasn't. I don't mean to just call everybody out in the comment section. I've watched the LPL for years and years and years. I remember looking at Gala when he first joined RNG as potentially a weakness for this roster. He's grown into a genuinely fantastic team fighter, maybe one of the best in the entire world. But he's never been someone who's been able to dominate lane. He's never been somebody who's been able to generate consistent leads, even against middle-tier LPL teams. He's always been someone that capitalizes off of RNG potentially being just a great team. Even before his RNG days, he just was never that guy who was going to dominate lane, even when he was doing really well on God, who were they, what were they called? That old team that eventually, DMO, Dominus? I think they were called Dominus. Whenever, I remember him on this garbage team towards the bottom of the standings. He was the standout player, ends up getting a job at RNG, and, like, again, team fight oriented. He was never a lane guy. He has started to figure it out. In play-ins, he was a lot better. I certainly am not going to say he was lane dominant in play-ins, but he certainly was better at being able to generate leads. He was awesome in this game as Aphelios. Play like this every game. I get it. You're playing against Shun and Koala. Not the same kind of competition you're going to be having in the LPL or on the world stage or anything like that. But come on, man. Like, this is the mentality I need you to have every game, not just when you're significantly better. Be able to generate your own leads. Gala played genuinely terrific. His positioning in the mid game was phenomenal, was able to gain a lot of favor for RNG in terms of map pressure, purely just by existing, because they couldn't walk into a team that had Aphelios there. His ultimates were clutch. He was able to chunk out this Victor, this Tristana, before these fights were even able to start. And don't get me started on the Flash Gale Force ultimate coming out at the end of this game. He had more engage than the Kennen did in that fight. It was so impressive. A great game from Gala. If he played like this every game, I would call him a top 2 or 3 AD carry in the world. I'm just saying that. Like, that's just the truth. This was the game of a top 2 or 3 AD carry in the world. He just needs to play like this every game, and then I'm going to start to feel a lot more confident. Obviously, got to give a ton of credit to Ming as well on this set. Set, obviously, a pick that RNG have gone to relatively consistently, especially in plans. It very much feels like a Ming comfort pick, and he certainly knows how to play this champion relatively well. The engages on set, if you can get them off, are just utterly devastating. That mid lane fight towards the back half of this game where he ults, I believe, the Amumu into everybody, gets that full face breaker, and absolutely eliminates the enemy team. Disgusting. Phenomenal from Gala and Ming. They continue to show why they are, late game at least, the power point of RNG. And to me, Ming is still arguably the best support in the world. To me, he is, but I know a lot of people aren't going to agree with that. I think he is only reaffirming that position at Worlds this year. He has, to me, undoubtedly been the best support at the tournament so far. But you got to give a lot of credit to everybody else, too. You gave Breathe Fiora. I'm not even going to talk about this. You get the Kennen to counterpick the Fiora in lane. It doesn't even really work, so whatever, it happens, but Wei gets his Viego. Nobody really plays Viego like Wei. This was a big reason why they were so dominant in spring, was Viego was super good and Wei was continuously getting him. Same with the Vi, and man, he's just able to take over a lot of these team fights. He knows exactly how to go in, and especially on these teams that have ridiculous forms of engage. Once you get kills with Viego, if you start getting those resets multiple times, he was able to get a kill, say, on Koala on this Amumu, turn into the Amumu, go Q in with the bandage toss, land it, turn right back into Viego because you have significantly more damage, and then just, you're full on the Tristana, or you're full on the Victor, or it's completely doomed at that point. Not only that, but he was able to completely dominate this mid lane matchup. Big shout out to Xiaohu on this Lissandra. Obviously, a really good pick for a team that really doesn't want to play around the mid lane right now, and I'm totally okay with it. I kind of complained about Faker on Lissandra, but that's only because, it's Faker. Not to say Xiaohu's not the better player right now, because I do believe Xiaohu is better, but I think Xiaohu's playstyle is a little bit more intuitive towards that supportive mid lane style, and I especially think that with Breathe in the top side, Wei is the jungle. Like, you do want to be supporting your jungle a tad bit more in this instance, because they're just better from ahead than, say, like Owner, who's really good from neutral anyways, and so just kind of a different team structure. But Xiaohu plays phenomenal in the Lissandra. The amount of lockdown that this Lissandra pick can have in good scenarios, it's just dominant. Really good game from RNG. Really not a lot to say. Gala's player of the game. Ming was a very close second. For CFO, tough loss. Definitely not the way he wanted to bounce back from a 1-0 start, but it's RNG. They're not quite the same skill level as 100 Thieves, and I think that'll be proven tomorrow, but the draft is okay. Again, a lot of really aggressive tools. Tristana Amumu just does not seem like the duo for me in the bot lane, and I think that got taken advantage of a lot. The Amumu pick was really not it. It really didn't do a lot of good things. In fact, the best times the Amumu was used was the bandage toss by Wei. For Shun, he was able to get a few resets, but just the damage, he was so far behind towards the back half of this game that legitimately I think he was doing less damage than, like, the Lissandra per auto attack by the end of this game. It was actually ludicrous. Shun was doing literally nothing. And then I gotta talk about my dead of the game here in Mission in the mid lane. Man, it just feels like mid laners, when they get behind at this tournament, like, really lose. I was talking in play-ins about how it felt like a very mid lane centric meta, where if your mid laner won, you were going to win the game. If your mid laner lost, you were probably going to lose the game. That seems to have carried over, at least to an extent. It doesn't feel like the winning side often has a dominant mid laner, but it certainly feels like the losing side often has a mid laner that is getting perma-camped in the early game, and that's what happened to Mission here. Just got completely destroyed by Wei and Xiaohu in the early game. That Lissandra lockdown, certainly not something to scoff at, and Mission ends up with 7 deaths in this game on Victor in 29 minutes. Not good. Certainly not what you want to see. Not like Rest and Gemini were helping him out at all. Rest got completely blown back in the counter pick in the top lane. Gemini just got completely out-pressured by Wei, but not a good game for Mission. Overall, what do I think? CFO is who we think they are. They might be better than 100 Thieves, which I still don't know. We got to see them play again. 100 Thieves certainly not looking good, but CFO's not good either. Like, they should not be a team that's going to be fighting to get out of groups. But it is impressive that they did have a relatively good performance at this tournament already, and if they finish 2-3 wins in this group, like, that's ridiculously impressive. If they're able to take a single game off of either RNG or Gen.G, that is absolutely huge, but just certainly not something I would expect. For RNG, great win. Really good to get yourself a 2-0. The play-in buff, I'm not going to say it entirely mattered here, but it certainly is good for getting things on track, especially when you're facing off against a team like Gen.G in the group who hasn't played in the longest of anybody in the world going into this tournament. And so, definitely a good win here. Set yourself up at 2-0. You've got a match against 100 Thieves tomorrow. That's super winnable. If you can start off this group at 3-0, you are in a very good position to be able to get out. Not that RNG wasn't just off of group draw alone, but they've certainly solidified that, and I especially love to see the development of Gala. If he can continue to be this good throughout the rest of the tournament, RNG might actually be the world contenders that a lot of people thought they were going into it. That's going to bring us to our 6th and final game here of day number 3 action at Worlds 2022. And man, was it a good one. This is one I've been looking forward to. Let me tell you that. This might actually be, for me personally, the most exciting match of the group stage because I think both of these teams are just so freaking volatile that anything can happen. And boy, did anything happen in this game as we saw the number 4 seed out of the LCK in Korea in DRX take on the number 2 seed out of the LPL in China in Top Esports. And everybody thought Top was going to dominate this group. DRX coming out of play-ins. None of it matters. DRX picks up a massive, massive, massive win in this group. This puts them at 1-1, much needed from their recuperants against Rogue yesterday. They really weren't supposed to lose that game. And they really make up for it by picking up a win here. Now both them and Top are at the same record. Unfortunately for them, Rogue winning today puts them alone at the top of this group. Certainly makes things interesting, but holy crap did DRX play super duper well in this game. Pioshik is in, and you know what? I think Pioshik was like, wait a second. It's my meta again. Graves is here, and they just pick Graves. They B3 Graves, and it's Pioshik on Graves. It's exactly what happened last year. It's exactly what happened in spring. When this champion's meta, he is dominant. Like, he is one of the best players in the world, legitimately. Obviously, the meme of Pio sick versus Pio shit is very, very real. These 50-50 games that he seems to have, sometimes he's the best jungler in the world, sometimes he's not, but man, did he show up today. And it's not like he had a schmuck of an opponent. He was going against the LPL MVP in Tion. I've been getting comment after comment after comment, especially on my top 20 list that I put out earlier before Worlds, when I put Tion at number 10, and I said, yes, Tion is a very good player, but he is overrated for the effect that he had on Top Esports this year. While he is one of the best players in the world, I don't know if he's a top 5 player in the world. I got a lot of flack. I mean, a lot of flack for that, but it's games like this that really make me question it and really make me feel more confident in it. Again, I'm not going to go off of a 1-game sample size. I didn't make my list off of a 1-game sample size, but Pioshik coming in, when you can dictate tempo, Tion's not the kind of jungler that can take it back. He's not Kanavi. He's not Peanut in that regard, where he's just always going to be relevant in terms of tempo. He's always going to be finding some avenue to be able to keep the game alive. He's not that. When he loses, and he lost this game, and Pioshik won this game. That's more of what I want to focus on rather than Tion losing. Pioshik won this game. Player of the game, 100% KP Graves, dominated the early game, was really able to get that Caitlyn Braum in a position where they were able to dominate that laning phase. Obviously, you pick the Caitlyn, it was left up. That's something that you really need to be able to win early on because she doesn't do anything late. The Braum for a bit more sustain in that lane and to help the trades against the Draven. Overall, I was a little bit sour about the pick when it happened, but I've really turned around on it, especially with how Beryl played this game. We talk about DRX being hyper inconsistent over the course of the full year, and obviously I completely agree with that, but the big inconsistent pieces for them were Pioshik and Beryl, who were 2 players that I think at one point were some of the best players in the world, not only at their positions, but period. Maybe that's a little grand for Pioshik, but certainly for Beryl. And both of them had very down splits. In summer, both of them really needed to be carried by Zika and Deft to be able to get to this spot in the first place, but you know what? They were the 2 MVPs against Top Esports in this game. Pioshik was phenomenal on this Graves, up and down the lanes, really no one could touch him, and I don't know if I've seen a better Braum game in a long time than what Beryl was able to pull out here. The amount of pressure that he was able to put on that Draven from Jackie Love was immense, and this isn't just some random Draven. We have to remember, this is Jackie Love's Draven. This is his best champion by a considerable margin. This is his favorite champion. he pulls it out here. It is a good matchup into something like Caitlyn, because if you can generate those stacks, you are just simply going to outdamage her, even in the early game. And so, I understand, right? Like, I understand the ideology, but man, Pyosik played too good, and most specifically, Beryl played too good to let that happen. If I was Jackie Love, I would have been so tilted this game. We'll get to that in just a bit, but Pyosik, player of the game, Beryl, very, very close. You want to talk about deft? He played the Caitlyn role really well. He was able to generate at least a decent lead in the early game, basically stopping the Draven from getting snowballed, and that was essentially his goal from minute 10 onwards. While the Caitlyn isn't always going to pressure too much in the late game, his goal was to make sure that Draven didn't have any sort of easy targets, because, man, he was starting to stack things up as DRX really kind of slowed the pacing of the game down, which I'm not complaining about. It certainly benefited them in the long run to be able to slow the pace down, move the thing along, essentially do that LCK thing where you look at the minimap or you look at the scoreboard at 15 minutes and you're like, okay, well, it's like a 4K gold lead, but like Top Esports is still relatively in it. They can get some kills on Azir and Draven. And then all of a sudden you look at it again at 25 minutes and somehow it's ballooned to like 8K and there's been no kills. You're like, how does this happen? Like the classic LCK, that's what DRX was able to do this game. Deft did a really good job of making sure his positioning was good, and Jackie Love's stacks were never going to come to fruition. This team in general just made sure that Top Esports was never really going to be in a position to be able to contest any of these fights. The team fighting was essentially perfect. Graves was doing infinite damage, and Zika was actually unkillable. The ultimates that he was able to get when he was able to steal Vi ultimate and get on the backline, that was huge. The times where he was able to steal a Zero ultimate were great. Nautilus ultimate was ginormous in some of these fights. Overall, I can't find a single weakness for DRX in this game. They played it relatively perfectly, and there's really nothing for me to complain about. As for Top Esports on the other side, gotta be frustrated by this loss. Clearly, you went into this tournament wanting to step up. This isn't the first time these two teams have been in group stage together. Remember, 2020 was a group stage between these two teams, but very, very different looking rosters. DRX had Chovy at the time, and Top Esports really hadn't broken out in the same way that they broke out this year. Yes, they had Knight, but they didn't really have the same kind of pieces around him, right? Tiana, I think, has really unlocked a lot of this team. I think not having Yuyanja as the support is obviously also a plus. No flame to Yuyanja. In fact, full flame to Yuyanja. Sorry about that. But, I would argue that Top Esports going into this tournament was a better version of what they were in 2020, and DRX was a worse version, and somehow DRX comes out with a win that they couldn't pick up in that year, as Top Esports really dominated that group. I believe they went 6-0 in that group, and really were just terrifying to have to play against. DRX really gets revenge for that here. Top Esports has got to feel bad. You draft this Draven and you really need to play through him in the early game. Unfortunately, he's just not able to do anything. He gets killed at 200 stacks. The backbreaker is around like 21 minutes where he gets killed and he has like 700 plus stacks and the ult just barely doesn't execute. Like, I would be so tilted if I was Jackie Love this game. Unfortunately, he's got to get the dud of the game because a lot of this was on him. Like, he just simply has to get these cash outs and he has to be able to carry the game. The onus is always going to be on the Draven player most of the time to be able to carry the game that the Draven is in. And unfortunately for Jackie Love, he was just simply outplayed by Beryl and Pyosik in this one. And so Jackie Love's my dud of the game, but that happens. It's not even like his positioning was all that awful. He couldn't fulfill the role that he was there for, and that's going to get you dud of the game. It wasn't just him. Tian, like I said, got completely out-jungled by Pyosik. Tian had literally zero control of the map. It's not usually I talk about how, like, junglers have, like, negative control, but Pyosik just had such a stranglehold on everything that was going on. Big credit to Beryl in this respect, too, with the vision control, but just, like, Tian had nothing. By 10 minutes in the game, he couldn't even walk in his own jungle. That is absurd. Really, really good game from Pyosik. Unfortunately, Tian suffered for that. Knight was their saving grace. He was everything that this team needed. He was up like 50 CS. He was second in the game in gold at like 20 minutes. Like, there was a real opportunity for Knight to be able to actually carry some of these late game team fights. Unfortunately, he had literally no help. And I think that's kind of been the case for TES when they lose this year. I don't mean to be that guy, but I've talked about this a lot in my LPL reviews. It's staggering how well Knight plays in losses for Top Esports. When this team loses, really the only times that Knight plays bad are when this team wins through bot lane. It's actually incredible the consistency with which Knight can be a power point on the map for a losing side. I'm not really sure what that means, but it is still pretty impressive. You definitely had a shot to be able to carry with the Azir in this game. Unfortunately, it just simply was not meant to be. So what does this end up meaning for both of these teams? Well, like I said, they're now both sitting at 1-1, which makes this group way more interesting because Rogue is sitting at 2-0. There's a real shot that one of these two teams could not make it out of group stage, and this could be a very pivotal result for DRX. I can't even imagine a world in which Top Esports does not make it out of this group, but this loss definitely hurts their chances. They're now sitting at 1-1. Obviously, you've got a game against Rogue tomorrow that's going to be massive, and I mean completely and utterly massive. If you're able to win that, everything's even, assuming DRX is able to beat Gigabyte Marines, or sorry, GAM, you get that Group A scenario where you've got 3 teams at 2-1, and then it just becomes who can perform best on that final day. But if Top Esports isn't able to take that game off of Rogue, which I don't think is an impossible thing to say, they're actually looking not so good at chances to get out of this group. Rogue sitting at 3-0, potentially DRX sitting at 2-1. You're going to have to pull off some miracle stuff in that final day. You're simply just going to have to be significantly better than DRX, likely going to have to beat them twice on that final day in order to get out, which would be pretty incredible. But for Top, you just gotta rally, you gotta rebound, and you gotta realize you have some of the most talented players in the world. If you can get into a position in the early game where you're not so far behind like you were in this, maybe you pick less volatile than Draven, as much as I love him, and as much as I do think he's a good pick. Maybe against a team that's really good like DRX, you want to go something a little bit more safe that can scale into the late game, give Jackie Love a chance. That might be the opportunity, but it's really hard for me to criticize this draft because it's something I would draft, if I'm being completely honest. And then for DRX, this is phenomenal. I mean, if they can keep this pace up, they've only got easier game before the split happens here against GAM. If they're able to win that sit at 2-1, they're actually in a pretty decent spot. They control their own destiny. Theoretically, every single game in this group is winnable for DRX, and if they win out on that final day, move on to the group or the knockout stage as the #1 seed, you're certainly not going to see me surprised. I've been hyping up this team all year long, and it feels very, very vindicating to see it come to fruition here on the biggest stage. All right, well, that is going to do it for my Worlds 2022 Group Stage Day 3 overview and analysis. All 6 games done, dusted, in the books. If you guys enjoyed, let me know down in the comments section below. Let me know what your favorite game of the day was. Who's your favorite team? Who are you supporting? I feel like I rarely ask this in my outros, but let me know your thoughts. Are you excited that NA is 0-7 or 0-8 or wherever we're at right now? Or are you excited that EU is really showing up on the stage? Let me know your allegiances down in the comment section below. I love to hear you guys' thoughts and opinions. And of course, you know, while you're down there, you might as well hit the like button. You made it all the way to the end of this video. That means you probably enjoyed the content that was out here, because we're at an hour plus. And so if you did enjoy, it would really mean a lot to me if you hit that like button. It really helps get this content out to more people, and it does let me know that you guys are enjoying these recaps and enjoying the World's content. Of course, if you're not subscribed and you made it to the end of this video, I highly recommend you subscribe. You hit that bell so you can get the notifications and the updates on when I post these videos relatively daily. Obviously, World's content coming quick and fast here as Worlds moves along. And if you guys are interested in, you know, in-depth, deep analysis on more World stuff, I highly recommend you hit that subscribe button and hit that bell so you can see when these videos go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.